Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Avatar Bible studies. Today we are in episode 12 of Book 3, The Western Air Temple. If you could turn with me to the book of Colossians, chapter 3 and verse 5, we'll be reading a passage that is hopefully familiar to a lot of you, but I want to establish the full context so we understand not only what's being addressed, but to properly set the tone for what we'll be talking about in today's episode. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience. Now, note this point. These are the things externally that God's going to judge, right? In which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. So the people being addressed here aren't the superior, holy individuals that have never, ever once done these things, and that's why God saved them. No, they've been forgiven of a lot too. And on top of that, as well as the recipient of forgiveness, it also goes a bit further. But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him. Then it goes on to note, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, no ethnic differences, circumcised nor uncircumcised, no religious ceremonial differences would be appropriate, barbarian, people who don't speak Greek, Scythian, foreigners in the most direct term, slave nor free, no class differences, but Christ is all and in all. So noting the forgiveness not only goes so far as to recognize what you've been forgiven of, but that it goes even further. Not just that I should stop doing the things that I needed to be forgiven of, but take it a step further and start doing the things that honor him, that are like him, which is what he goes on to say. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on, so not just put off, but put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so also you must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection, and let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which you are also called in one body, and be thankful. So thankfulness, or the recognizing of something as good, starts and ends with the love of God. And the love of God was demonstrated towards us in forgiving us of the sort of things that he is rightly going to judge the world for. But when you ask the question, okay, that's a good description of the Christian life, forgiveness needs to be a part of it, but what does that have to do with today's episode? Well, verse 13 in particular, regarding the, so also you must do in regards to forgiveness, is very much a good theme for today's study, because Zuko was the recipient of a lot of forgiveness. And I don't just mean a lot of forgiveness in quality or quantity, but in diversity as well. He received many types of forgiveness, three of which I want to draw attention to, and hopefully not only how the Bible explains the strengths and weaknesses of each, but also how they were illustrated in today's episodes. You all know what I'm talking about. Starting with the first type of forgiveness, I want to draw attention to Combustion Man, believe it or not, in the type of forgiveness that a lot of people enjoy, and that is of self-determination. I feel like forgiving you, or I don't. The strengths of this type of forgiveness is that forgiveness on a personal level feels right because it gets to be decided by the person most directly involved. And in a way, it is biblical, because in Psalm 51, and David acknowledging his sins, says that in verse 4, against you and you only I have sinned and have done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. So the one with the right to decide whether or not I forgive you is probably going to be the offended party. Now, the weaknesses of this type of judgment, of this kind of forgiveness, is that we can be wrong as to what time is the right or wrong way to forgive somebody. Because in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12, it says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death. Now, if you're still confused as to how Combustion Man demonstrated forgiveness at all in today's episode, let me explain. Combustion Man was told by Zuko, the bounty is off, not hiring you anymore. And while there were other reasons that Combustion Man was following through on his assassination of Aang, he chose, note this, in light of everything that he had been through along the way, that Zuko had made the mistake of hiring him, but not to walk away from it, to see it through to the end. I'm not going to forgive you for your mistake in hiring me. You're going to experience your mistake by seeing me finish the job you started. He had gone too far and done too much to let it go, so he personally decided not to forgive for the same reason that we don't. We don't want to. Which is why we oftentimes don't default to this as the best form of forgiveness, but rather the second form, which we'll discuss here now. The second form of forgiveness was demonstrated by Katara on the basis of merit. Do you deserve to be forgiven or not? Here are the reasons why or why not. Now, the strengths of this obvious form of forgiveness is that you're fair in who you're forgiven why. Likewise, it also keeps insincere people away and draws people trying to be good, or at least are good at being good, closer. And just like the previous example, it just feels right for us to not only know and determine, but decide for ourselves who is worthy of forgiveness. Now, the weakness of this is that when you consider those last three words, worthy of forgiveness, anyone who's consistent would realize no one is worthy of forgiveness. What do I mean by that? Well, note the merits and demerits, if you will, are all based on some sort of moral standard, some sort of law. When God forgives us, if the right way to forgive would be to examine who deserves it and say, well, in light of this, and this, I decide you're not worthy of forgiveness. No one's passing that metric because the purpose of the law isn't to find out what you did good, but where you went wrong. This is Romans chapter 3 and verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, note the purpose here, and that all the world may become guilty before God. This is the purpose of the law, to prove guilt and awareness that you've done something wrong. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So if you say, I haven't sinned in this particular area, you have in others. It doesn't make you better for keeping certain laws, because as the Apostle James makes the point of noting, whoever is guilty in one part is guilty of all. I may not steal, but I have murdered. It may not make me a thief, but I am a murderer. And if you've obeyed one law but violated the other, you're still guilty and worthy of punishment. So let's apply it to today's episode. Katara called to mind the things Zuko had done before. She laid out the law and came to the conclusion what kind of person he was and would continue to be. And that seems right. To use the past to determine the sincerity in the present and the personality of the future. Just like Katara's history as a thief, her activities with Toph as a scam artist, when she was found guilty of performing those scams, she broke out of prison, which is a criminal offense. She harbored a terrorist group, regardless of whether she knew they were as such. They attempted to flood a Fire Nation village, among other things. And, noting her future, would attempt to brutally murder someone with bloodbending, despite the fact it was against her principles to even use that. Plus, was she right about Zuko's heart and future? That's why we need to leave concepts like ultimate justice in more capable hands. In Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 10 we read, I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, to give to each man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. If anyone has the right to judge us on the basis of merit or demerit, the only one who could know the heart, the present, the future, the past, in its proper context and in light of his perfect nature, it would be the one who actually has one. Because Katara ain't perfect either. She doesn't have that right, and it would be hypocritical for her to hold Zuko to standards that she herself couldn't live up to. And this is the point. When we ask, but what about the self-determination thing? Isn't it biblical for someone to come to God and say, well, I've done this against you? Yes, but notice, to God. Well, doesn't Proverbs say that if you do what seems to be right, that it's wrong? No, it says there's a way that seems right to a man. We have the flawed perspective, and he doesn't. So hopefully, if you're paying attention, you hear both of these kinds of forgiveness and say, well, if God's going to use these against me, I'm toast. Exactly, which is why the good news is so important. The third type of forgiveness that Zuko received and was demonstrated by Aang is grace. The strength of a gracious, a goodness by nature form of forgiveness is that both parties will always benefit from this direct display of God's heart. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 6 through 8, we read, and remember in Colossians that we started with, how did Christ forgive us? Let's read it. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. So notice, not the people who were doing the good things and just deserve to have the little stuff brushed under the carpet like Mormons would teach. No. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 says, by nature children of wrath, just as the others, destined, doomed, and innate in our personalities to be headed to hell like everyone else. That is when Christ died for us. When we were his enemies, when we were season or book 1 Zuko, that is when God offered forgiveness. Got an Uncle Iroh thing going on here. However, that being the strength, there are also weaknesses. Because when it comes to this kind of forgiveness, the only one who can truly, properly, and wisely demonstrate this kind of mercy from the heart is God. So, in order to put this into proper perspective, think about Zuko when I review this historical account in the life of Jesus and how it was very similar to the encounter the gang had with Zuko. Because if it's on the basis of deserve or don't deserve, we're in trouble. But fortunately, we're dealing with more than just the heart of fallen, sinful people, especially in regard to Katara. This is Luke chapter 7 and verse 36, and I want to read all the way to verse 50, and I encourage you to read along with me. Then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him. This is referring to Jesus. And when he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat, and behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner. We've established that. When she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil, very expensive, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself. Notice he's not saying this out loud. Jesus knows his heart. Saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. Thank you, Katara. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. So he said, say it. Teacher, say it. There was a certain creditor, he's giving an illustration, who had 2 debtors. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him, remember Colossians, more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And Jesus said to him, you have rightly judged. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil. These are the basic courtesies in the ancient world. But this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. And by the way, some scholars note this was the bottle of perfume she would have reserved for her wedding night. So something of great personal sacrifice as well. Say, for example, walking away from your status as prince. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, he acknowledges that, are forgiven. For she loved much. But, here's the punchline, to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Who has the right to forgive sins but God alone? They're exactly right. Then he said to the woman, your faith, your trust with reason, has saved you. Go in peace. Note the reality of forgiveness and the fact that on the basis of whether or not we feel like it or deserve it, it's never going to be consistent with how much we need to be forgiven, because at the end of the day, we all got stuff that we got to deal with between us and God. Otherwise, we'd be with him. When it comes down to it, there's only one person who could be judged justly and not end up in hell, and that is God. But if, on the other hand, we recognize that we have been forgiven of much, of whether it's, well, I haven't done those things. Yeah, but you've done other. Well, I wasn't our enemy for 2.5 seasons of the show. Yes, but you have done things, and there were certain episodes where you were very much on the antagonist side of the deal. You have a lot to answer for as well. Well, I may not have those kinds of struggles, but you do have other struggles in other areas. Well, I haven't killed anybody. Yes, but what is your internet history like? Well, I don't cuss people out. I watch my mouth. Yes, but are you sarcastic and cutting? It's a big one for me. When it comes down to it, if we aren't recipients of mercy, we're toast. But being recipients of mercy, now what do? Do you live like it? Do you love much, like you've been loved? Or do you perpetuate and justify and continue to do the sort of things you had to be forgiven of in the first place? This is the Christian life, is realizing how much we've been forgiven and being thankful. Because at the end of the day, if that isn't expressed in our life, then naturally we won't forgive, but that also means that we won't be considered Christians either. Because that's what Jesus did with us. And I want to act like him if I'm calling myself someone who acts like him. Thank you for your time in listening to the study. If you have any sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who would be blessed by this message, please share it with them. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you and how he demonstrated it. Not by forgiving you because he felt like it, or not, because he wouldn't. Not because he assessed the merits of your better nature and then forgave you because they outweighed your demerits of the things that you got wrong. Because, let's also be honest, he wouldn't. He forgave you because he's just that good. I wouldn't relate to him any other way, and I hope you don't either. We'll see you all again next time, and until then, God bless you.